Hi, everyone, and welcome to my pre-recorded lecture for the 2021 Sagan Exoplanet Summer Workshop. My name is Trevor David, and I'm a Flatiron Research Fellow at the Center for Computational Astrophysics in New York. And today I've been asked to talk about observations of young planets at different evolutionary stages. Briefly, I'll discuss a bit about the theoretical expectations for the evolution of exoplanets, summarize what we've learned from observations of young exoplanetary systems so far, and then provide some assessment of whether those observations are compatible or incompatible with various theoretical predictions. And the talk is organized in 5 parts. First, I'll provide some background on why we study young exoplanets and what we hope to learn. In the next 3 parts, I'll discuss the evolution of exoplanet radii, atmospheres, and orbits. And we should keep in mind that the evolution of all 3 of these parameters, along with planetary mass, may be correlated. And then finally, I'll summarize with some preliminary conclusions and speculation about what observations of young planets are telling us so far. So first, we'll start with our motivation for studying young planets. And to provide that motivation, I'll begin with these figures, which show the distribution of detected exoplanets in the mass separation and radius separation planes. A lot of exoplanet science is focused on understanding what gives rise to the overdensities and underdensities in these diagrams. Those features can result from some combination of the planet formation process, that which occurs before the protoplanetary disk disperses, and the subsequent evolution of planetary systems, everything that occurs after disk dispersal, not to mention some observational biases. The motivation for searching for young planets is that they should more closely resemble the outcome of the planet formation process, before evolutionary effects have had much time to change planet properties. And by comparing the distributions of young and old planets in diagrams like these, we might better understand which signatures are imprinted at formation and which are the subsequent result of evolution. So this talk will concern the evolution of planets shortly after disk dispersal. And specifically, I'll focus on close-in exoplanets, planets interior to about half of an AU. And these are most often detected through transits and radial velocities. And I'll primarily focus on close-in super-Earths and mini-Neptunes. These are low-mass planets, and those form the larger cloud of points in the bottom panel there. And they're the most intrinsically common outcome of planet formation that we know of. But I'll also include a brief discussion of hot Jupiters, which are nearly 2 orders of magnitude less common around Sun-like stars. One of the problems with studying the evolution of planet properties is that of the more than 4,000 exoplanets known, only about half have published ages, and only 2% are younger than 100 million years. Why do we know of so few young planets? There are at least 3 reasons, I believe. 1, there are relatively few young stars which are near the sun and amenable to planet searches. 2, determining stellar ages is difficult because their properties change very little over most of their lives relative to the precision with which we can measure those properties. And 3, the most prolific exoplanet detection methods are biased against young active stars. Direct imaging is actually biased towards younger planets, but current instruments are only sensitive to very massive planets on wide orbits, and surveys have found planets in that specific region of parameter space seem to be intrinsically rare. So, since many evolutionary processes occur slowly, we aren't able to sit back and watch an individual planet evolve with time. Instead, we have 2 avenues for inferring the evolution of exoplanets. One method is to find and characterize planets in coeval stellar populations with well-known ages, and these provide benchmark planets for evolution models. And the other method is to first find planets with a blind survey, then age date the planet hosts after the fact. Now, both methods can help us track the evolution of average planet parameters, which we can then use to validate or refute theoretical models. The main drawback of the cluster method is that there are only so many young stars near the sun, which are amenable to planet searches, like I just said. And the main drawback of the age dating method is that stellar ages are difficult to determine. But I believe both approaches are needed to piece together the most complete picture of exoplanet evolution possible. Now, since this talk is focused on observations, I wanted to take a moment to illustrate the observational challenges and different stellar activity regimes of young and old stars. These animations were created with Starry, an open source Python package for modeling stellar and planetary surfaces. On the left, we see a surface map, flux time series, and RV time series of an old photospherically quiet and slowly rotating star with the same mass and radius as the sun. And the planet has typical parameters parameters of a typical sub-Neptune. Now on the right, the same three panels are shown for a young star with a heavily spotted surface. And notice the different y-axis scales here. In the case of the old planet, we see that the transit dominates the light curve, and the RV time series is dominated by the reflex motion of the star, which is induced by the planet. And there's also a modest RM anomaly, a Rossiter-McLaughlin anomaly, which I'll explain later, during the planet's transit. On the right, I've depicted a star with the same mass, but a larger radius, as you would expect for a pre-main sequence star. And the planet also has the same mass, but now the size is larger, as you might expect for a young planet. And although it's difficult to tell here, the transit at right is actually deeper than the transit at left. But both the photometry and radial velocities are overwhelmed by modulations due to star spots rotating in and out of view. And again, although it's subtle here, you can see that the transit is not perfectly symmetric, but actually has a bump in it due to the star's inhomogeneous surface along the transit path. And it's important to note that the RV variations at the right are only apparent RV variations due to shifts in spectroscopic line profiles, which I'll describe more later. So for this theoretical but somewhat realistic case, the Doppler motion from the planet is completely overwhelmed by the variations from star spots. However, because the star is rotating so much more rapidly, about 10 times faster here, and because the planet is inflated, the Rossiter-McLaughlin anomaly is much larger. And in fact, the RM amplitude is larger than the Doppler amplitude at left. So observing the RM effect is actually an efficient way of validating young exoplanets. So we'll start by discussing evolution in planet sizes, since size is so far the most direct observable for young, close-in, low-mass planets. And we've established that a basic premise for studying young planets is that these planets may be able to tell us something about the planet formation process by revealing the initial conditions of planets after the disk has dispersed. So what does theory have to say about a planet's initial conditions? In the standard core accretion scenario, a close-in low-mass protoplanet will accrete to its Bondi radius, which can be found by setting the protoplanet's escape velocity equal to the local sound speed of the disk. And the mass of this envelope would simply be the density of the disk gas times the volume of the envelope. But if this were the final atmosphere that we observed, then we would expect much larger envelope mass fractions rather than the few percent atmospheres we typically observe for most older close-in planets. So various studies have tried to confront this problem with the standard core accretion scenario, and one solution is through mass loss. So while the planet is embedded in the disk provides pressure support to the planet's atmosphere. And when the disk disperses, this pressure support is lifted, and the planet can undergo a rapid period of spontaneous mass loss, so long as the disk dispersal timescale is much shorter than the cooling timescale of the planet's envelope. And the process I'm highlighting here is referred to as boil-off, but similar processes have been studied by a number of different authors using different assumptions. The plot on the right shows the very, very early evolution of a low-mass planet in the first million years after disk dispersal. And note the axis scales here. The planet starts off with an enormous radius, approaching the size of the sun. But under the boil-off process, the radius quickly shrinks to about 1/10 of its initial size, and in the process, up to 90% of the envelope mass can be removed. The detailed physics are outlined in the references provided, but the basic idea put forth in Owen and Wu is that the upper atmosphere is heated to the planet's equilibrium temperature by the stellar continuum, and this launches a Parker wind. And this wind brings about rapid gravitational contraction of the planet, which then fuels further mass loss until the planet has contracted so much and its luminosity has dropped so significantly that it can no longer power the mass loss. So I'll stress that there are plenty of other suggestions for how low mass planets evolve, and this is just one. But because this process is so rapid, we've not actually observed it, and it may be pretty difficult to do so. So it's an open question of whether this process actually occurs. So how can we determine if this proposed stage of boil-off actually occurs? James Owen proposed an experiment that would allow us to answer this question, provided we can get precise measurements of the planet's mass, radius, and age, and in particular, if that planet planet is in the age range of 30 to 50 million years or so, and close enough to its star that it would be susceptible to photoevaporation. And that's a topic that will be covered by Aline Vidotto and BJ Fulton. So in the absence of any internal energy sources, a planet will cool and contract through the Kelvin-Helmholtz process. The Kelvin-Helmholtz timescale, or cooling time, is the time it takes to radiate away gravitational binding energy at the planet's current luminosity. The curves at left show the theoretical evolution of planets with different envelope mass fractions, given by the red and blue curves, which either start with a short Kelvin-Helmholtz timescale, the dashed curves, or a long Kelvin-Helmholtz timescale, the solid curves. So a longer Kelvin-Helmholtz timescale would be associated with a boil-off scenario, in which the planet loses lots of mass initially, rapidly cools, which lowers the entropy of the interior. So planets which have undergone boil-off could be said to have aged prematurely. In other words, they appear as though they've been cooling for much longer than they have. The problem is that we don't actually measure this timescale. We only measure a planet's total mass, its radius, and its age. And this is a problem because of the two degeneracies noted here. First, different combinations of core mass and envelope mass can give a planet of the same mass and radius, essentially because we don't know the core composition a priori. And second, even for an assumed core density, the envelope mass is degenerate with internal entropy. And this is described by the phrase below: a planet with known mass and radius can have more mass in its core and less in its envelope if it's hotter or has a higher entropy envelope. So the way around this is to leverage the fact that we expect young planets to be undergoing additional mass loss through photoevaporation. An old planet has cooled for many times its initial Kelvin-Helmholtz timescale, so its formation history has been mostly erased. But young planets may have Kelvin-Helmholtz timescales that are comparable to or longer than their age. And if we assume mass loss through photoevaporation, there's some minimum envelope mass that will be stable against photoevaporation for a planet of a given mass, radius, and age. This then translates into an upper bound on the planet's entropy. So at a fixed radius, a higher entropy envelope contains less mass and is more susceptible to mass loss, whereas a lower entropy envelope needs to be more massive and is able to resist mass loss for longer. So for a young planet of a given size, a very low mass would imply more masses in the envelope, and the planet started off with a lower entropy, as you'd expect in the boil-off scenario. The upshot of this is that if we can achieve 10 to 20% precision in a young planet's mass, radius, and age, we could distinguish between these two theories. So how do we get planet radii as a function of age? The ratio of a planet's size to its host star size is directly observable from transit photometry. So the best way to study the radius evolution of close-in exoplanets is through transit surveys and dedicated searches of young star light curves. Now, nearly all of the transiting planets known around young stars have been discovered from Kepler, K2, and TESS. And many of those planets were detected from targeted surveys like those listed in the lower right. So here are the fields, the Kepler, K2, and TESS fields overlaid on the Gaia view of the Milky Way. And I've cut corners a bit with TESS, which doesn't actually observe the entire sky, but it nearly does, save for the ecliptic plane, which is tiled by the K2 fields. But the idea here is that time domain surveys have tiled the sky, and in doing so, they've observed stars over a range of different ages and galactic environments. Now, at this point, it's worth noting that the light curve of a star depends sensitively on both the star's mass and its age. This slide shows how a solar mass star's light curve changes over the course of its life. Each panel at left shows 2 months of data from either Kepler or K2, and at right is the theoretical evolution of a one solar mass star in temperature and radius, with the point color corresponding to the star's age. The boxes indicate the evolutionary stages depicted in the light curves at left. And note here that the star reverses course in the HR diagram after reaching the zero-age main sequence at 100 million years. At 1 million years, the star is still hosting a protoplanetary disk, and the light curve on this 2-month timescale appears to be entirely stochastic with brightness variations of more than 250%. And at this stage, it's not necessarily clear how much or what parts of the photosphere are in view, so it's very unlikely that we would detect a transiting planet from optical data like these. The next 4 light curve panels have the same y-axis scaling, showing a total range of only 5% in brightness variation. Between 10 and 100 million years, not much has changed, except the star's spin should speed up a bit as it contracts down to the main sequence. And between 100 million years and 1 gig year, there's substantial angular momentum lost in the stellar wind, and the star has spun down considerably from a period of under 3 days to about 10 days. And then by about 3 billion years, the star has spun down even more, but more importantly, the flux changes associated with the star's rotation have been substantially reduced. So the rapid rotation and large brightness changes of young stars are at the heart of the issue of detectability of close-in planets at young ages. So what have these transit surveys of young stellar associations revealed so far? One of the main results to emerge from these targeted searches is that at the youngest ages, meaning less than 100 million years, nearly all of the detected planets reside in sparsely populated regions of the known exoplanet parameter space. So here I'm showing a kernel density estimate of the number of detected exoplanets in period radius space. And overplotted in orange squares are planets younger than 100 million years, and then green circles are planets in the 100 million year to 1 gig year age range, respectively. So it's important to note that the contour colors here represent the sheer number density of planets detected to date, but not the overall occurrence rate. So this figure is really meant to give a quick impression of what outcomes of the planet formation and evolution processes are possible rather than what outcomes are likely. If we instead restrict the sample to only those planets detected with the Kepler telescope, we get a less biased view. This is still not an occurrence map, but it's much closer to it than the previous slide. And here we see now that most of the hot Jupiters have gone away, and we see even more clearly how atypical the youngest planets are in period radius space. In fact, all of the youngest transiting planets in orange are larger than Neptune and smaller than Jupiter. We know from the Kepler mission that close-in planets larger than Neptune are very uncommon around middle-aged or older stars, at least at close periods, and you can see that by the contours. The other observation we can glean here is that the characteristics of planets in the 100 million year to 1 gig year age range by and large resemble those of the overall exoplanet population. And it's important to note, again, the existing and completed transit surveys are highly complete in the upper left quadrant of this diagram. That's to say, if large short period planets were a very common occurrence around older stars, transiting exoplanets would have revealed that to be the case. However, completeness for the youngest stars has not been fully characterized yet, and it's likely that the blue triangle at right is shifted upwards for younger stars, and we'll discuss that more in a minute. So another way to visualize the age dependence of close-in planet properties is by collapsing the data along the orbital period axis and looking merely at planet size trends with age. So this figure shows the sizes of transiting planets with orbital periods less than 100 days and well-characterized host stars. The points outlined in black show planets found in stellar associations or around young field stars with well-known ages from a range of surveys, while the lighter points are taken from the CKS catalog, California Kepler Survey. We see that at ages less than 100 million years, essentially all of the transiting planets detected to date are larger than Neptune, a planet size which is rarely represented around older stars. But by around 100 million years, most of the detected planets have sizes that are more in line with the field population. And by 300 million years, we have a few examples of small rocky planets. And by 1 billion years, the planet size distribution seems to be practically indistinguishable from the size distribution of field planets. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that survey completeness varies significantly with age due to the fact that stellar associations are at different distances, and the stellar activity associated with youth has an impact on transit searches. The shaded triangle is meant to highlight this, but we don't yet know what the shape of that region actually looks like. And I would direct the listeners to Andrew Mann's talk for more details on the issue of completeness. Nevertheless, the data are at least qualitatively compatible with theoretical predictions for low mass planets in that larger planet sizes are expected and observed at younger ages. Now, there have been many interesting results in the field of young transiting planets over the last 5 years, but I want to spend a moment talking about one system in particular simply because I think this system can help us answer a lot of the questions raised by examining young planets at the population level, and in particular, the issue of apparently inflated radii. So the system is V1298 Tau. It's a 20 to 30 million year old star, roughly similar to the sun in mass, and it hosts 4 transiting planets inside of half of an AU. The K2 light curve for the star is shown in the top panel, and the phased planetary transit signals are shown below after removing those intrinsic stellar variations, which are due to the rotational modulations of the star. I've chosen to focus on this system not only because I know it well, but because there are no other stars, young or old, that are yet known to host so many large planets at such close orbital separations. In fact, if you add up all their radii, you find that there are about 30 Earth radii of planetary material inside half of an AU. And it's tempting to dismiss the apparent radius inflation of any single young transiting planet as a statistical fluke or a result of low search completeness. But this explanation becomes much harder in a single system where all of its detected planets are larger than Neptune, sizes which again are intrinsically rare for close-in planets. So we've established that the planets are large, and atypically large it seems, but we haven't conclusively shown that they're inflated. And this is difficult to do because young stars are not amenable to precision radial velocity work in the optical. Fortunately, Kepler multiplanet systems have a remarkable property that allows us to get rough estimates of the masses from the period ratios alone, if we just assume that young and old multiplanet systems have similar dynamical properties, and specifically dynamical spacings. So early analyses of Kepler multiplanet systems revealed that the spacings of adjacent planets in multi-transiting systems tend to be distributed in a very predictable way and well modeled by a Rayleigh distribution. In fact, the most common spacing between planets is about 20 mutual Hill spacings. And the beauty of this observation is that once planets in a multi-transiting system have been detected, all that is needed are the observed period ratios and a chosen mutual Hill spacing to then infer plausible planet masses. So for the planets in the V1298 Tau system, assuming a range of plausible mutual Hill spacings from the distribution shown in the upper left, and then using the observed period ratios, we're able to conclude that the sums of masses of planet pairs in the system are relatively low. The two innermost planets, which also have similar sizes, are likely to have a combined mass less than 30 Earth masses. And similarly, planet B, despite being close to Jupiter in size, is very likely less than a third the mass of Jupiter. So if we take these plausible masses and then plug them into a mass-radius relationship, which is determined mostly from older exoplanets, we can then infer that the planets in the V1298 Tau system may contract by 40 to 90% as the system evolves. And that range is so uncertain because of the range of plausible masses is so large, and there's considerable spread in exoplanet mass-radius relations. So if we accept that young planets like those in the V1298 Tau system are inflated, then we would expect young planets to contract down to sizes which are more commonly represented at older ages. And we can try to predict the future evolution of planets using the analytical theory of photoevaporation. But even then, there are substantial uncertainties due to the facts that A, we don't yet have mass measurements for the planets, and B, we don't know how the high energy output of the star evolves. And so this is shown by the equation for energy limited mass loss up top, where for most young transiting planets we know of, only the planet's broadband optical radius and its present day XUV flux are known at best. At right, possible X-ray luminosity evolution tracks are plotted based on observations of stars in young clusters. And we see that V1298 Tau, indicated by the star, has a relatively high activity level for its age, and that the future X-ray output of the star is uncertain at the order of magnitude level. This uncertainty, combined with the uncertainties on the planet's masses, translates into vastly different outcomes for the planets, for which theoretical evolution tracks are shown at left, those vertical lines. If the innermost planet has a core mass less than 5 Earth masses, for example, it should lose all of its atmosphere for all plausible X-ray evolution curves. However, if the core is twice as massive, the planet only becomes stripped if the star remains on that high activity track, the blue track up in the upper right. Similarly, whether other planets in the system become mini Neptunes or stripped super Earths depends entirely on the planet's core masses and the XUV evolution of the star. The only planet that appears to be likely safe from photoevaporation is the outermost planet. And for a more detailed description of the physics behind photoevaporation, again, see the talk from Aline Vidotto. Now, I want to focus on another aspect of the radius evolution of close-in planets, and that's the emergence of the radius gap. So BJ Fulton's talk will cover this topic extensively, so I'll just discuss these different theories briefly. The first theory of how the radius gap might emerge is the gas core formation scenario. And in this scenario, the radius gap is imprinted at formation. So if close-in planets are assembled towards the end of the protoplanetary disk phase, then what determines whether a planet becomes a super-Earth or a mini-Neptune may just be whether or not the planet build up enough mass to hold on to its atmosphere by the time that the disk dispersed. So think of this scenario as a race against time. The other theories focus on evolutionary effects, and they're united in the sense that they're all models of atmospheric loss. In each of these models, a planet's atmosphere can be eroded when the energy is deposited into the atmosphere is comparable to the binding energy of the atmosphere. That energy could be provided by impacts. It may be provided by the high energy radiation from the host star, as in the photoevaporation model, or it may come from the planet itself, as the planet's core cools and contracts, which deposits energy into the envelope. The point is that each of these mechanisms are thought to operate on somewhat different timescales, or at the very least, different mechanisms should be dominant at different times. So examining how the sizes of planets evolve in time may help constrain the physical scenarios that give rise to the radius gap. So the two theories I'll focus on here are the photoevaporation and core-powered mass loss theories. And again, the physics of these processes will be covered in other talks, so I'll really just focus on the predictions these models make as a function of age. First, in both models, the radius gap emerges on gigayear timescales. Some super-Earths should be present before a gigayear, but the overall planet size distribution appears to continue to evolve on these long timescales. Next, because young sub-Neptunes have not finished contracting, the average sub-Neptune size is larger at earlier times. And similarly, since the smallest, least massive planetary cores should lose their atmospheres first, the super-Earth population fills in from the bottom up. There are two implications of these 2 points. One is that the gap is wider at earlier times, and the other is that the precise location of the gap shifts to higher values over time. And lastly, because sub-Neptunes are converted to super-Earths and not the other way around, the relative fraction of super-Earths should only increase with time. So is this what we see in the data? Possibly. So there's recent evidence that the Kepler exoplanet demographics have an age dependency. And specifically, the fraction of super-Earth detections relative to sub-Neptune detections is higher for older stars, after some rough accounting for completeness between young and old samples. On the left, this is apparent when comparing the planet size distributions between young and old planetary samples, where the host stars here are generally more massive than the sun. And on the right, the ratio of super-Earth to sub-Neptune detections changes as a function of age within the California Kepler survey sample, which is shown by the gray trend line. And again, both of these studies do some approximate accounting for completeness. Now, it's only about 2 sigma result, but if it holds up, it would be compatible with a scenario in which some sub-Neptunes are converted to super-Earths on gigayear timescales. And as we just saw, both photoevaporation and core-powered mass loss models would seem to be compatible with some fraction of sub-Neptunes losing their atmospheres at such late times. And what about the radius gap itself? So here again, there seems to be some evidence that the planet size distribution is changing over gigayear timescales, and in such a way that the radius gap seems to shift to higher radii over time. Here I'm showing subsamples of the CKS sample, which have been selected to have young ages from an empirical gyrochronology analysis. So we look for the fast rotators to identify the young stars, and the slow rotators, or the sort of aperiodic stars, to identify the older stars. And if we compare the distributions of planets in the period radius diagram for planets orbiting fast rotators and slow rotators, we see a stark difference. The planets orbiting fast rotators present a clear gap, whereas the same gap appears more filled in, or at least obfuscated by imprecise radii on the right. And I'll note that these stars have been selected to have similar ranges in mass and metallicity, so while the 2 samples are not entirely devoid of other physical correlations, they're fairly similar in other regards. So I mentioned that the imprecise radii seem to obfuscate the radius gap, and that it may be a little bit emptier than we tend to assume. But if we restrict this type of analysis to only those planets with the most precise radii, we still see a difference in the size distribution between the young and old planets in the CKS sample. So here's the probability distribution of planetary radii for young and old planets, where error bars here have been determined from bootstrap resampling of the data. And what's key here is that the difference in the size distribution occurs over this really narrow size range. And I'll show in the next slide that the planets which appear to be missing or underrepresented at the younger ages are very likely to be rocky planets. So if the largest rocky planets are in fact missing at young ages, then one possible interpretation is that the largest cores to experience total atmospheric loss do so on, over billions of years. So this figure shows the radii and densities of all known exoplanets with periods less than 100 days orbiting solar-type stars, so similar to the CKS sample, with masses known to 25% or better and radii known to 10% or better. The beige swath of parameter space indicates rocky planetary compositions, while the blue swath indicates a region where some non-negligible fraction of the planet's mass must be composed of volatiles in order to explain the low densities. The pink band indicates the young planet gap that I was just discussing, while the shaded vertical band shows the location of the radius gap determined from another study based on planets orbiting astroseismic stars. And while the young planet gap appears to be filled in with planets that are all consistent with rocky compositions, essentially, the radius gap determined from that astroseismic sample really spans the transition between rocky and gas-rich compositions. So this is how we know that the planets that appear to be missing at young ages are likely rocky. So now I'll talk about how exoplanet atmospheres evolve and how the observational signatures of exoplanet atmospheres might evolve. So a commonly employed method for studying the atmospheres of transiting planets is known as transmission spectroscopy. And more detailed descriptions of the method will be covered in other talks, but briefly, the idea is to gather spectra before, during, and after an exoplanet's transit. And signals which are due to the planet will be seen as differences between the in and out of transit spectra, so long as the star's surface is not changing significantly throughout the observations, and so long as the star's surface across the transit path is fairly uniform and represented of the surface as a whole. And that might be a difficult requirement for young stars. But basically, if some atomic or molecular gas is present in a planet's atmosphere, you'd expect to see enhanced absorption at the transition wavelengths of those atoms or molecules. In other words, the planet appears to have a larger size relative to the star at those specific wavelengths. And the reason we're so interested in the atmospheres of young planets is twofold. One, it may help us better understand the initial conditions of typical planetary atmospheres. And two, naively, we might expect young atmospheres to produce large transmission signals because the planets appear to be inflated. And an important parameter determining the strength of planetary absorption in a transmission spectrum is the atmospheric scale height. So young planets should have large atmospheric scale heights, resulting in large transmission signatures. Now, even though these young close-in exoplanets are observed to have large radii, and so they're expected to have large atmospheric scale heights, nature has not yet been so kind to reveal to us the composition of a young planet's atmosphere. Instead, in the limited number of studies undertaken so far, what has been observed are featureless or flat transmission spectra. And while it's still very premature to conclude this is a definitive trend, at the moment it appears that the young planet studies so far show these flat spectra. And one way to generate a flat spectrum is through dust or hazes. And so if dust can be generated and sustained at high altitudes, this would explain two things, both the featureless transmission spectra and the apparent radius inflation of young planets. So essentially, the broadband optical transits observed by TESS or Kepler would be probing lower pressures and higher altitudes than would be conventionally assumed if the atmospheres were just clear hydrogen and helium. Fortunately, there's a testable prediction from the dust or haze model, and that is if young planets are encircled by high altitude dust or hazes, then we would expect deeper transits at bluer wavelengths. If this turns out to be the correct model, it raises several interesting questions like what chemical compositions of the dust or hazes are present, and is this a generic evolutionary stage for low mass planets or a phenomenon that's only seen occasionally? So here are some examples of how the spectral shape depends on the haze or dust composition, the two panels on the upper left, as well as on the planet's mass and envelope mass, which are shown at right. And in the JWST wavelength range, the transit depths could be about twice as shallow as the optical transits. You can also test the dusty outflow model if you have precise enough optical transit data. So the bottom plot shows how an outflow would subtly change the transit shape. It's a small effect, but if you had ultra-precise photometry, you might be able to find that the planet's shape is not perfectly spherical, and you might be able to argue for the presence of some dusty outflow. So given that the youngest planets appear to be inflated and also that they're exposed to copious amounts of high energy radiation from their stars, we might expect young planets to be actively losing their atmospheres. And to demonstrate atmospheric escape observationally, you have to show that a planet's radius exceeds its Roche lobe at some transition line. And this in turn requires knowledge of a planet's mass. So a number of diagnostics have been used to probe escaping atmospheres, primarily in hydrogen and helium. And I won't go into each of these in detail, except to say that there are pros and cons for each diagnostic. Lyman alpha, for example, which is one of the best probes, is only observable from space. And the core of the line is unusable due to ISM absorption and geochronal emission. The helium infrared triplet, by comparison, is observable from the ground. It's much less susceptible to ISM absorption, and it should be less susceptible to stellar activity, although maybe not totally disentangled. But it's also sensitive to the stellar spectrum. So there are many probes of atmospheric escape, and some references are provided here for more information. But as far as atmospheric escape goes, the evidence so far is mixed. Here's a summary table of observations attempted in search of atmospheric escape from young planets, and this might not be entirely exhaustive, but at least for the young transiting planets around solar type or lower mass stars, this is the census. And as you can see, there are many groups working towards this goal. There's a detection of excess helium absorption in the V1298 Tau system, which may be tentative, as well as Lyman alpha absorption in the HD 63433 system in the 400 million year old Ursa Major Association. But I think we need more data before we reach any firm conclusions. And I'll mention that Kelt 9b is a young hot Jupiter that has been studied extensively and seems to show signs of atmospheric escape, primarily in H alpha. But it's a pretty extreme system in many ways, and it's qualitatively very different from the low mass planets we've been discussing. Not to mention that stellar activity doesn't manifest in massive stars like Kelt 9 the same way it does for young solar type stars. So in that sense, A-type stars should actually be more manageable. So in summary, because this field of young planet atmospheres is still so new, and we'll really need more observations before we can say anything conclusive. Now, for the final section of my talk, I'll focus on observations that are aimed at understanding how the orbits of planets evolve. And specifically, the observations I'll discuss are aimed at finding young planets belonging to specific classes of planets that are thought to have undergone orbital evolution, as well as observations studying the orbital alignments of young planets. So to start this section, I'll spend a few minutes discussing hot Jupiters. As I mentioned, these planets are a very rare outcome of the planet formation and evolution processes. But there's significant interest in understanding the origins of hot Jupiters, as they are the longest standing mystery in the field of exoplanets. So it's been proposed that by searching for hot Jupiters around stars of different ages, we might be able to deem some formation channels more likely than others. And the basic channels for creating a hot Jupiter are summarized in this cartoon. Broadly, there are three channels for the formation of a hot Jupiter. One, the simplest explanation is that hot Jupiters form in place or in situ before the gas disk disperses. In the cartoon, this formation pathway travels from the bottom left directly to the lower right. Another possibility is that a Jovian mass planet forms further out in the disk, the way we believe Jupiter formed, then smoothly migrates inward due to a net inward torque exerted by the protoplanetary disk. Now, if a hot Jupiter forms in place, or if it migrates in through the disk, then we'd expect the frequency of hot Jupiters to be unchanged between about 10 million years when the disk disperses and a few billion years, which is the typical age of most known hot Jupiters. However, if the planet forms further out and does not migrate in before the disk disperses, then the only way we know of bringing the planet onto a close orbit is to first excite the planet's eccentricity, which could be done through three-body interactions. And then a planet with high eccentricity will experience strong tidal forces from the star, and over time, its orbit will shrink and circularize. So discovering even a single hot Jupiter at a very young age would demonstrate that either in situ formation or disk migration is a viable formation pathway. Now, to understand why RV detection of planets is challenging for active stars, we have to understand the difference between real and apparent Doppler shifts. On the left, I'm showing what a real Doppler shift due to the presence of a planet looks like. The entire spectrum shifts back and forth depending on the orbital phase of the planet, and the amplitude of that shift does not depend on your wavelength. So real Doppler shifts are achromatic. But the animation from Donati on the right illustrates the problem with active stars. As a spot rotates into view, we see an accompanying distortion in the spectral line profile. So when you then go to measure the radial velocity of a spotted star, you'll see the star appear to move, even in the absence of any companions, just due to the fact that the star's surface will appear different at the time of observation from when your spectroscopic template was recorded. So if we assume we got our spectral template when no spot was in view, then when the spot is on the approaching limb, it blocks some of the blue shifted light, and we would measure a net redshift. And the inverse is true when the spot is on the receding limb. So instead of measuring real Doppler shifts due to the star moving in space, you're measuring deviations from the template due to the fact that the star is rotating and its surface map is changing. Now, there are techniques like Doppler imaging that aim to construct a very accurate surface map of the star, but these observations are expensive, and up until now, it's been assumed that the map remains static over the weeks or months that the stars followed. And given how quickly the light curves of young stars evolve, this assumption might not be valid. But so far, transit and radial velocity surveys have not yielded a secure hot Jupiter candidate at ages younger than about 200 or 300 million years. Transit surveys have found a couple of Jupiter-sized planets in multi-transiting systems, but the only problem is that Jovian-mass planets should be larger than Jupiter at young ages, and old hot Jupiters are rarely ever found in multi-transiting systems. So it seems more likely that these planets are sub-Neptune progenitors. The Kelton-Wass surveys have, however, found some bona fide hot Jupiters around A-type stars with ages of a few 100 million years. Radial velocity surveys have also found a few hot Jupiters that seem secure around solar-type stars several hundred millions of years in age. But many of the hot Jupiters claimed from RV searches around younger stars have not been independently confirmed. And here's one example of a young hot Jupiter that was previously claimed based on the gray data points in the top panel. And Carleo et al. Nicely showed that the observations acquired in the near IR and even the optical RVs from different epochs did not support the planet claim. So again, true Doppler shifts due to the reflex motion due to a planet should be achromatic. This should not depend on the wavelength of observation. So here's a table summarizing the basic details of young hot Jupiter detections. And this may not be entirely exhaustive, but it's provided as a reference more than anything else. And I just wanted to highlight that, unfortunately, many of these systems could not be independently confirmed. The systems which have stood up to scrutiny have been those around older stars, where stellar activity presents less of a challenge, and those around more massive stars, where the intrinsic occurrence of hot Jupiters is higher. And while stellar activity has presented a serious challenge to the detection of planets through the radial velocity method, understanding the occurrence of hot Jupiters as a function of time is an important goal, and our methods of mitigating stellar activity should only improve in the future. So it's really important to pursue both the planet detection as well as the quote unquote planet killing studies. Now, young transiting exoplanets also offer a compelling avenue for understanding the origins of spin-orbit misalignments. And many hot Jupiters, for example, are observed on these misaligned orbits. So the naive expectation from planet formation theory is that the normal vector of a protoplanetary disk is closely aligned with the stellar spin axis. So any planets forming in the disk should therefore be born with an orbital angular momentum vector that is aligned with the stellar spin axis. But studies of mostly giant transiting exoplanets have found plenty of examples of planets with gross misalignments between their orbits and the host star spin axes. Sometimes these planets are orbiting perpendicular to the stellar spin, and sometimes planets are even found on retrograde orbits. And there are a number of theoretical expectations that have been proposed as capable of providing such orbital tilts. And I won't go over them in detail here, but provide some references for those who are interested. The important point is that some of these physical mechanisms are thought to operate on different timescales. Since young exoplanets have had such a limited time to evolve, if they're found to have a spin-orbit misalignment, then it clearly means that whatever mechanism produced that misalignment must have operated quickly, which in turn may help rule out certain classes of theories. Similarly, if enough young exoplanets are found and studied, and none are found on misaligned orbits, then that would seem to imply that the dominant mechanisms responsible for spin-orbit misalignments operate on much longer timescales. So a common method for measuring the spin-orbit angle of a transiting exoplanet is through the Rossiter-McLaughlin effect. So as a planet transits its host star, it blocks some portions of the stellar photosphere. So in the first case on the left, a planet in a prograde orbit, which is aligned with the stellar spin, will first block the approaching blue shifted limb of the star, which results in an apparent redshift, since the overall flux contribution from the redshifted limb appears enhanced relative to the blue shifted limb. As the planet crosses the receding redshifted limb, the opposite happens. For the misaligned case in the middle, a similar sequence of events happens, except the planet spends more time crossing the redshifted limb, so the RM signature is asymmetric. And then in the case on the right, where we have a very misaligned planet, the planet never crosses the blue shifted limb at all, so we only see a negative RM anomaly. Another method for measuring the spin-orbit angle is Doppler tomography, which is beautifully depicted by these animations from Marshall Johnson. So in this method, one looks for deviations from the average spectral line profile during a planetary transit. And on the left, we have a planet in a prograde and fairly aligned orbit. And as the planet crosses the stellar disk, we see a small deviation called the Doppler shadow, traverses the spectral line profile from the blue shifted limb to the red shifted limb. And in the middle panel, we have a planet that's on a nearly polar orbit. And in this case, the planet never crosses the red shifted limb of the star. And we see the Doppler shadow remains close to a projected velocity of 0, since the planet transits nearly perpendicular along the stellar spin axis. Finally, on the right, we have a planet on a relatively aligned but retrograde orbit. So we see the Doppler shadow cross from the redshifted limb to the blue shifted limb, the opposite sequence of events as the prograde orbit on the left. Now, what does actual data look like for a young solar type star? This visualization from George Zhu tells the story beautifully. And here the visualization shows residuals from some average line profile instead of the profile itself. So deviations from this average line profile throughout the course of the observations contain information about any features crossing the stellar surface, whether that be a planet or a star spot. In the animation above, two transits of the same planet acquired on different dates are shown along with some hypothetical star spot models that do a good job of reproducing the data, along with a model of the planet's Doppler shadow. In the case of this young star, the spectral line profile variations are dominated by the effect of star spots rather than the planet's shadow. And moreover, we can see that the surface maps required to fit the data at the different epochs are quite different from one another. It's well established that star spot modeling is subject to degeneracies, but even so, it appears likely in this case that the surface map of the star has changed between these two observations. At top here is another representation of the data shown in the previous animation. The images show residuals from a template line profile with time in the vertical direction. On the left, we see prominent streaks, mostly in the vertical direction, due to star spots rotating into and out of view. Once a star spot model is removed, we see in the next panel a dark streak which traverses the line profile from -20 to +20 kilometers a second, which is the projected rotational velocity of the star. And that persists throughout the duration of the transit, which is indicated by the black horizontal lines. The final two panels show a model for the planetary contribution to the profile variations, the Doppler shadow, and the residuals after subtracting both the star spot and planet models. Then in the bottom right, for the same star observed by a different group, we see the measured radial velocities along with the RM anomaly. And here it's critical to use an appropriate model for the out-of-transit variations in order to accurately infer the spin-orbit angle. Reassuringly, both groups came to the same conclusion that the spin-orbit angle is low, meaning the orbit is relatively aligned. And that's particularly notable in this case since the host star DS Tuc A actually hosts a binary companion at about 180 AU, which additionally appears to orbit in a similar plane as the planet's orbit. So in this case, at least, it appears the companion did not significantly alter the orbit of the planet, which is one proposed theory for primordial spin-orbit misalignments. So to wrap up the spin-orbit alignment section, this plot from Ju nicely summarized both the scientific reasons we study spin-orbit alignments in young planets, as well as some observational results. And I've added in the approximate regions where additional measurements have filled in since this figure was produced. In brief, we can say that some spin-orbit alignments may be observed by about 200 to 300 million years, but at younger ages, the observations to date have suggested orbits that are mostly aligned. And those come from, again, low mass, close-in planets. Now, the last class of planet I want to talk about are ultra-short period planets, or USPs. These are planets in the bottom left corner of this figure. And they're discovered with the transit method, and they always have orbital periods less than 1 day. That's the definition. It's somewhat arbitrary, but that seems to line up with a real population of planets that's separate from the super-Earths at longer periods. And so far, these planets have only been found orbiting solar-type or lower mass stars. And USPs are intrinsically rare, but they present a serious challenge to standard planet formation models, much in the same way that hot Jupiters do. While we don't yet understand how they formed and evolved, we do know quite a bit about this class of planet. So apart from being rare, they appear to be more common around lower mass stars. They're also found almost exclusively in multiplanet systems, although they typically have unusually large period ratios with their neighboring planets, and they tend to exist in multiplanet systems which show larger mutual inclinations between planets. USPs are also always smaller than 2 Earth radii, and they trace a very tightly defined locus on the exoplanet mass radius diagram, indicating that they have rock-dominated compositions. And the fact that these planets almost certainly orbit inside the dust sublimation radius of the protoplanetary disk indicates that they could not have formed where they are observed today. They must have undergone some kind of dynamic evolution. Furthermore, while the planet occurrence rate declines inside of 10 days, it falls off even more steeply interior to 1 day, which is again suggestive that some kind of non-standard evolution is responsible for these planets. And there are a number of theories for how to produce USPs, most of which involve tidal dissipation, either in the star or the planet. And I won't go into details there, but just as was the case with hot Jupiters, some of the mechanisms take longer to operate than others. So in principle, some models would produce a time-dependent occurrence rate, while others would not. And finding a young USP would provide a tight deadline by which the correct evolutionary process, if there's only one, must adhere to. And it just so happens that tests recently revealed a USP orbiting a 100 to 200 million year old star, and this was reported in Hedges et al. 2021. This result tells us that at least some USPs must arrive on their short period orbits quickly. And it's compatible with another recent study which showed the galactic velocity dispersions of USP hosts are indistinguishable from field stars, which tells us that their ages are not very different from the ages of field stars, which in turn favors a fast formation channel for this type of planet. So the study of young close-in planets is still very new and there's much left to be learned, but we've already learned a fair amount, and I've tried to summarize what some of those points are. And I'll caution that some of these conclusions are preliminary, and it's very possible, if not likely, that your own work will revise this picture in the future. So those points are: 1, the sizes of the youngest planets appear to be inflated, and dramatic size evolution seems to occur in the first 100 million years after disk dispersal. 2, evolution of the planet size distribution and the radius gap continues beyond 1 billion years. 3, atmospheric loss explains many features of the close-in exoplanet population well. 4, evidence for ongoing atmospheric escape in young planets has largely been inconclusive. So despite the fact that we think atmospheric loss is really a good model for many of the observations of exoplanet demographics, we have not yet found conclusive evidence for atmospheric escape in a young planet. The fifth is that transmission spectra of young transiting planets are so far featureless, and dusts or hazes may explain both the flat spectra and inflated radii of young planets, and that model provides testable predictions for the future. 6, spin orbit alignments can arise early in some cases on timescales of a couple 100 million years. But the youngest planets, those less than 100 million years, so far appear to be fairly aligned. 7, some rocky worlds, including at least one USP, are present by about 100 million years. And then the last point is that some hot Jupiters are found around 300 to 800 million year old stars, but we really require more evidence for the younger systems, those less than 10 million years. So thanks for listening.